Why have we come to earth? Do you remember? Why have we taken birth? Do you remember?
Good morning again. So we're continuing the exploration of our year-long theme, creating a world that works for all. And today we're going to look at the idea of that we are all individual creations of an infinite creator. I'll say it again. We are all individual expressions of an infinite creator. Ernest Holmes, in What We Believe, summarizes it this way. This one manifests itself in and through all creation, but is not absorbed by its creation. So the one is the creation itself and is greater and is more than that. And by the way, that's what distinguishes us from Star Wars: The Force. Did you, those of you who have been around for a while, when somebody asks you to explain, what you believed in, did you ever kind of say, well, it's kind of like the Force in Star Wars, right? I know I've used that, and I know Cynthia talked about that for her kids and stuff like that. And it's very similar, excepting that in Star Wars, the Force is the sum of all living creatures. What we say is, yes, this infinite presence is that, and it's more. It's beyond just all living creatures. It's more than that. It's also different than the model that many of us grew up with of a God who created a world, set it in motion, and then watched to see what would happen. Most of us know that story pretty well, right? Because if you grew up in any kind of a Christian or Judaic or Islamic tradition, that's the tradition of a God. And throughout history, God or gods had created some sort of a world, put humans on it, and let's see how it all works out. And so it's neither one of those. This is a God that is alive, currently involved in and as the creation it is. We are God in form, co-creating the experience that we're having together. It's an active, involved, current, present, infinite presence. Okay, so and I like that, by the way, don't you? It feels like there's something that I can relate to that is right here present. It's not some big guy that might intervene and get my football team to win. Obviously, that doesn't happen because the Seahawks are not playing today. It's not some God that will come down here and manipulate things around, or will save us at the last minute, or will stop this war or start that war, or whatever. It is not that. It is an infinite presence that we co-create with together. Yesterday I was at a celebration of life service for a woman named Mrs. Isaac Howe, who, if you've been around here for a while, would recognize as a civil rights activist in the community, I'm told. I never met her. She was I came after she was active, let's put it that way. But she did a lot of pioneering work to create civil rights and a space of racial respect and more and greater equality here in the community. And I heard while I was there some stories of what it was like, years ago when people were here, and some of the discrimination, some of the challenges that were happening. Some of it still is happening to this day. And I was reflecting on the lines that we create to separate ourselves. That while we are infinite creations, individualized expressions of this one creator, we create all these little lines of separation. We do them around race, we do them around gender, we do them around religious beliefs, we do them around nationality, economic status, political parties, states. My state's better than your state. Northern California is better than Southern California. And then of course there's the people who want the state of Jefferson to take it away. Rather than a new state, what we really need is a new state of consciousness. Because whether I secede my state from a union, whatever union it is, or create a new state, if it's created in the same old way, with the same old consciousness, it's going to get the same old result. And we've done that plenty of times. So Sharif Abdullah talks about that there are 3 stories that are operating on the planet. And I think it's good today to dive into what those stories were. We've referred to them in the past, but I want to go in a little deeper. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read a little bit out of the book here itself. So the first one, the oldest story, is the Keeper story. It's the original story of humans. Before I do this, I should mention that there's a model that says that if you could take all of the existence of this planet and put it into a movie that lasts for 1 year. So at 12:01 a.m. on January 1st, the planet Earth formed. And the present moment is midnight on December 31st, okay? Life started in about March of that movie. Human beings came with 11 minutes to go in the movie, okay? And the second story we're going to talk about, the breaker culture, started with 2 seconds left in the movie, which is the life that most of us are living in, the story that many of us are living in right here and right now. And it has the ability to destroy all of life on the planet. Okay? 2 seconds. It reminds me of somebody who walks up to a beautiful redwood tree that's been growing for hundreds or maybe even thousands of years, and with a chainsaw in 5 minutes can wipe all that out. Okay? So that's where we are. That's that dream that he was talking about of falling and not quite sure where he is from the ground. So the oldest story, for most of that 11 minutes, is the Keeper story. Keepers are people who live interconnected with their local ecologies and all other beings. They keep the ancient ways of living, perfected over eons of coexistence, and their story is based on a thought, living in harmony with all I encounter, and an assumption, the land is abundant. Okay? So that's the Keeper story. They don't have a concept of Earth as a whole, and they're identified with their local ecologies. So that's the first story and the oldest story that we've been doing. And it says the ultimate expression of the Keeper story is the village constructed with local materials and interrelated with the local ecology. The second story, the breaker story, is at present the dominant story for humans. Breakers are those of us who act as though everything on and in the earth was created for us, and that we have the right and responsibility to place it all under our control. The breaker story is based on a thought, I am separate, and an assumption, there is not enough. Breaker behavior is based on control and manipulation of other beings. The ultimate expression of that story is the city, where nature is almost totally suppressed, and it is worth noting that civilized values are those associated with city, which in Latin is civitas, with city life. So we only became civilized when we started forming into cities. Finally, the Mender story is the emerging story for humans. Menders are people who are conscious of the global ecology and the interactions of all the beings who make up that ecology. Menders adopt the values of keepers on a global reality. The Mender story is based on a thought, we are one, and an assumption, there is enough for all. Menders dedicate their lives to restore the balance, integrity, and regenerative capacity of the web of life. So, we're all playing in this story, and what I want us to be aware of is all 3 of these stories coexist within us individually right now. So it's not something that's happening out there with other people. We all have a keeper part of us. We all have a breaker part of us, and we all have a mender part of us. And so it's looking at how that story lives within us, and where do we put our attention, and where are we moving? See, the keepers, it sounds so beautiful, doesn't it? It sounds so, I just want to go back to living like, off the earth and without all this other stuff. The thing is that as he points out, the typical keeper culture, in many of the villages, they don't even name their babies until they're a year old because so many die. Oftentimes the diseases that the breaker culture has already created cures for with simplicity and ease. they're very attached to their local ecology, but they don't see the global picture of how they fit in. So there's this level of low consciousness of their individualized nature and of their relation to the whole, while there's a high awareness of their relationship to each other and the local ecology. Margaret Mead talks about a culture that she visited in Australia that had a belief in where the end of the world was, and that when she walked across that line, they could not literally see her any further. And they started mourning for her loss and her death. And when she walked back, they were astonished because nobody had ever done that before. And so that's the mentality of a keeper culture, is it only goes so far. It's a beautiful culture, it only goes so far. So along comes the breaker culture. The breaker culture has technology, and technology is intelligence about things. And it's valuable for our liberation and expansion as humans. The breaker culture is an objective view of life. So we start to be aware that we are separate from, individualized from one another. And the core belief, of course, is I am separate, which is different than I am an individualized portion of the whole. Okay? So it has intelligence about things, but it lacks wisdom, which is intelligence about relationships. So a great example of that is we can do this, but the question is it wise to do this? Yes, we can make more nuclear bombs. Do we really need them? I believe right now there's enough nuclear bombs to drop 6 on, or to take out, I think, 6 times the world population, whatever that works out to. There's enough nuclear bombs still on the planet, even after the, taking it down a notch, a number of years ago, to still wipe out 6 times the current population of the planet. Do we really need that? And so it's taking a look at that. Mender wants to mend. It wants to bring the relational wisdom of the keeper and the objective view of the breakers together. And so you might say it's technology with heart or technology with a global awareness. And that's what we're aiming for, is to be aware of that. We can't go back as a culture. We've got 7 billion people on the planet. We can't go back to living the way it was. A great example of breaker culture was that Captain Cook on an island in the Indian Ocean that had a beautiful grassy island, decided when he visited it to leave behind a few rabbits for further explorers to have for food when they came by. Okay? Just a few rabbits. Guess what? There were no predators on the island. There was nothing against the rabbits. There was plenty of grass. They multiplied and multiplied, and they do what rabbits do. They multiplied some more, and they ate all the grass. Pretty soon all the grass was gone. The rabbits didn't have a food supply, no way of connecting to another landmass to get any more. So the rabbits all died, the grass all died, and today that island is just a rocky mass with no grass and no life on it. So that's an unawareness of the ecology, if you will, of the relationship of, is what I'm doing in the highest and greatest good? 100 years ago, we thought cars were a wonderful replacement for horses, because horses made the place stink and messy and polluted. And today we're looking at the internal combustion engine as doing the same thing. How do we do something that's in a relationship, that's in a holistic relationship with the planet? How do we find a fuel source, create a fuel source that is that way? So we're starting to look at that. We start to look internally. Where do I have a belief in, I've got to stick to the old ways, my old culture? Where am I willing to start to branch out and expand a little bit? And am I doing so in a way that is harmonious with the rest of the planet? See, a teenager is oftentimes a perfect example of a breaker. They stop being and doing what mom and dad want them to do, right? And they have to have their own way and their own setup, and they don't care how it fits into the family, and they don't care what the results are, oftentimes, of their actions. And they don't think about it long term. You've noticed that? Some of us have done that. Okay? We've been that. And so in a way, this breaker culture is our adolescence that we're going through. And it's time to become adults. I love the saying that we're all children of God, except I think it's time for us to become adults of God. to grow up and understand that we are co-creating the world together and to take personal responsibility in that process. So when we recognize that all life is individualized forms of the one life, we look at the combined thought and belief of this breaker culture, which so many of us are involved in, that says, I am separate and there is not enough. And that combination creates spiritual starvation in our lives. And it's what so many people today experience. It's why the suicide rate is so high among young people. Here it is, I can either have a life that resonates with me, but I can't get what I really want to survive and to do well in life, or I can have a life that has monetary wealth or some sort of satisfaction over here, but starves my soul. And I look to the future and see all these ecological problems, and it feels like there's no hope. And so it's like, it's a whole bunch of bad choices. Why do I want to stay here? Let me out of this place. Okay? That's spiritual starvation. So what's the antidote for that? How do we start to move from that consciousness? And the antidote is compassion. The antidote is starting to involve our hearts in the process. To move from head knowledge, that knowledge that knows how to do so much. And it's not to abandon it completely. There's nothing wrong with head knowledge in and of itself. It's what separates us and frees us and takes us up a level from the rest of life. We are the universe becoming conscious of itself. Okay, and that's an evolutionary process. And so we have to move from being not conscious or conscious of ourselves just as this little tribe to being conscious of ourselves as individualized, to being conscious of ourselves as individualized parts of a whole. And so we're making that journey. And there's nothing wrong with that journey. It's just, it's time to make the rest of that journey or the next step of that journey. And so the antidote is compassion. The antidote is being open to and receptive to love. But this is a challenge for many of us who have grown up in a world, in a universe, not a universe, but a world that doesn't teach us how to be receptive to love. An example of how this works is a child in, say, Uganda with dysentery. Body can't hold and retain water. And so they need water, they need the moisture, but the body can't retain it. And in fact, by giving them more water, you just wash the nutrients out of the body and hasten the death of the child because they can't absorb it. There's very simple ways with minerals and some chemicals to get the body triggered to start absorbing more water. Not often available to people in very poor countries, but that's available. To get the body to triggered and rebalanced to where it starts to absorb water. See, for us, if we can't absorb love, if we don't get that we're being given love constantly, that we're immersed in a field of love, we can try to give love, but we continue to give and give and give until we're empty. What comes in goes right out, and nothing gets retained, and we're still working off of a feeling or a belief of I'm not enough, or I am separate, and there's not enough. See, the core of what we all want is love, right? It's what we're really looking for. God is love. We're expressions of God, so what are we really looking for? We're looking for the field of love in which, by the way, we're already immersed, but we've forgotten it. You know, it's the old fish in water metaphor, looking for the water. And so how can we start to open ourselves up to absorb that love more fully? And that's going to be our practice we look at this week, is how do we start to do that? How do we create that consciousness? The Buddha said, we learn not from experience, but from our capacity to experience. See, experiences fly by in our lives all the time. Do we have the capacity to internalize them and then grow and learn from them? But it takes that capacity. It takes that ability to let it in. And what that takes is an open heart. What that takes is a willingness to feel. And it's tough sometimes to feel that. Sometimes when we look out at the world, sometimes when we look at just our own lives, it's hard to feel some of the feelings that we don't want to feel. Many of us have had, it's like we start into an area of our life, it's the shadow area. But a lot of people don't like to do, especially in New Thought, what's known as shadow work, looking at, our own shadows and dark parts, because we don't want to go back and feel those feelings that we shoved into that shadow in the first place. And so we don't want to face them, but guess what? The only way out of those feelings is through those feelings. Re-experiencing them and moving free of them. And many of us sit there and go, but I don't want to. Okay? And yet the freedom, the process is to go through. The mother bird kicks her young one out of the nest lovingly. The baby bird, by the way, does not perceive that as love, does it? Probably. Okay? And the other loving thing the mother has done is built the nest high enough so that on the way down, the baby bird has enough time to process and sit there and go, I'm going to die. I've got to do something about that. And quickly remembers, oh yeah, I've got wings that my mom has been talking about all this time. Let's see if they work. And learns to fly on the way down. We're on, before they go splat. We as a culture, and oftentimes as individuals, are kicked out of the nest. A lot of us are living in this world that we feel uncomfortable in the world because the old style and the consciousness, the divine consciousness within us, has kicked us out of the nest and said, this doesn't work anymore. It is time for you to grow up and learn you have wings to fly. And we're in the process of, I love that dream metaphor, that dream story that we had. We're in the process, and most of us want to keep our blindfolds on. I don't want to look at it. I don't want to look at it. I don't even want to know when I'm going to hit the ground. Let's just have that as a surprise and pretend it's not going to happen. Okay? And when we take the blindfold off and start to get conscious, we notice that we can fly, even though we were told we couldn't. We can lift up and create something new. And so each of us individually in our lives can lift up and create something new if we're willing to engage our hearts, if we're willing to look, truly look, to become aware, to pay attention to the life that we are living and the life that is around us and to the truth of who we truly are, and to take the blinders off. There's that wonderful old saying in Paul that's currently we look through a glass as darkly. In other words, we can't see it very well. But then, which is a time of enlightenment, we will see things clearly. It's time for us to become enlightened enough to see things clearly and to take that blindfold off, to take the blinders off and look. And we do that with love. So I'm going to invite us to do 2 spiritual practices this week. The first one is to remind ourselves that we are constantly receiving love. To remind ourselves, because most of us don't know that. Most of us don't really, at a gut core level, get that. So reminding ourselves that we are constantly receiving love. Some ways to do that are to meditate on the infinite love. When I do visioning, I start by, and it's called invoking the field of love, but really it's invoking our attention to the fact that we're already in the field of infinite love. So I love to meditate on just simply, I'm immersed in the love of God. I'm immersed in the love of God. When I start getting off course, that's one of my mantras that I start to remind myself, I start to bring myself back with, I'm immersed in the love of God. And so I start to remind myself that no matter what it looks like out here, I'm still immersed in that infinite, deep, beautiful, powerful love. And to open up to that. Secondly, become aware of the ways that love is being given to you. Love is being given to you constantly. The chair you're sitting on was created in love. The ushers who you passed by who handed you a program when you came in did so in love. I do this talk for love. You come here in community for each other for love and in love. All the volunteers who set this place ahead of time and who hold this place do so in love. The people who built this building and the building itself, the people who created the materials out of which the building was built, which are a different set of people, did it in love. Now sometimes it's not consciously in love, right? I'm just here at a job. I'm just making this chair. I'm just doing this thing, okay? What if we brought love to everything we do? If you remember the old movie, it's not that old, but like Water for Chocolate, where there's a lady who's cooking for everybody. And when she's happy, everybody who receives the food is happy. And when she's crying and sad, everybody who receives the food is crying and sad. And when she's angry and upset, everybody gets sick. Okay? And it's a wonderful metaphor for what we do. See, most of the time we're trying to work in the world of effects out here and shift around the effects when we need to go back to the world of cause. What is the cause? And we're going to talk about that in the second spiritual practice. So we become aware of the ways that love is being given to us. Everything is love. And then finally, to reconnect with our self, our deep self, to reconnect with others, to really truly pay attention. You know, somebody recently described somebody who listened in a way, such a way that when you were talking to that person was just listening to you. Do we do that? Can we do that? We can do that, but do we do that? And then finally, to reconnect with what Sharif Abdullah calls the more than human world. That's the world beyond human beings, okay? The animals, the plants, the nature itself. Can we listen deeply? One of the poems that was done by Rumi's Caravan invites us to listen. Listen deeply. That we have lost the art, but we can find it again and practice it again, of just simply deeply listening. Do we simply sit at a place in nature and just listen? One of my greatest lessons was many years ago. I was a photographer with the Sierra Club's camera committee, and I just had all my camera equipment stolen, and we were going on a trip to a particular place down by the coast. And so I went with him just for companionship, but I didn't have anything to take pictures with. And one of the girlfriends of one of the people who was photographing, who was Native American with polio, so an interesting journey in her life. But she motioned me over and said, quietly, come here. And so I walked over, the crew was over here photographing all the pretty sunsets and ocean stuff and all the scenic stuff, right? And we went over, and in this brush, under the brush, we watched first this little mouse run from bush to bush, followed by a little bird who would hop from bush to bush, followed by a rabbit who would hop from bush to bush. And it was a trail. Each of them were following. It's like the mouse was the lead. If the mouse survived, the bird would go. If the bird survived, the rabbit would go. And this little interaction was taking place among these three little beings in this particular atmosphere. And it took being still before they would even move. It took being still and noticing. Do we be still and notice? Because that's another way to reconnect to the love that is fully present. So that's our first spiritual practice, is to remember and remind yourself that you're constantly in and receiving love. The second practice is to remember your oneness with all in every encounter this week. Practice that. And when you encounter it, note that if you have any belief in separation or not enough. And just notice that. And then when you do notice it, because you will, if you're like me, you will, okay, forgive yourself and love yourself. And come back to remembering our oneness. So if we have the thought of separation, if we have the thought of I'm separate, and if we have the thought of not enough, what we teach is that thought will create the experience of separation and not enough. And so wherever in your life you hit not enough, you're doing your bills and you're sitting going, I don't have enough money. You're living in a universe of infinite abundance. All we're lacking right now is the understanding of how to connect with that in a way that shows up as the enoughness in my life. And that can be learned, that can be experienced. If we're feeling lonely and not enough love, we can reconnect with that love, because we're living in a field of infinite abundance and infinite love. So wherever you're experiencing that, wherever you notice that happening, and that's the path to spiritual starvation, by the way, if you remember. So the path to spiritual feeding, the path to spiritual nutrition, nourishment, is to remember I am one with all, and there is an abundance for all, including me. So that's our two spiritual paths this week. Remind yourself you're constantly receiving love, and practice remembering your oneness with all in every encounter. So I invite us that we collectively do that. If you do that, and if you have a process, if you have an experience out of that you would love to share, either just write me a note. If you'd like to talk about it, that's fine. If you would just like to share, and it's okay to mention it from the platform at some point in time, that's fine, even if it's anonymous. Because It helps other people to learn your experiences and your successes and your victories. However small you think they may be, it may be something that supports and shifts someone else. So I invite us to collectively share our good, to collectively share what's working for us. I invite us to do that process. And so I would love to receive any input from you of how this is working and how this supports you. So I want to close with a quote from Albert Einstein, who says, "A human being is part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts, and his feelings as something separate from the rest, a kind of delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty. And part of the way to do that is to move past the belief that I am an individual, separate part of the universe, and to recognize my oneness with all. Yes, I'm an individualized expression of that, but I'm simultaneously one with it all. So I invite you to play with that this week. Let's move into prayer. So in this moment, I simply recognize that there is this one life, oneness, wholeness, infinite love, experiencing and becoming conscious of itself, an infinite abundance of joy, of love, of life energy, of power, of beauty, of intelligence, of all forms and all expressions of good. This one infinite presence is all that there is. And because of that, we are one of it. Each of us, individually and collectively, is one of this infinite presence. And so we already are in the love, the wisdom, the intelligence, the beauty, the power, the grace, the abundant good. This already is our nature. And so I speak my word that we reject, we cast out all that has kept us separate from that belief, from that awareness, and that we move into a greater and greater and greater awareness of this truth and allow it to flow like sunshine into our lives. As we greet a new day, as we greet a new dawning of awareness of this truth, we feel that warmth of this light of this sun, of this truth warming our hearts, warming our lives, bringing greater and greater life to our very beingness, to everything we do, everything we are. We say yes to this truth. We allow ourselves to absorb this truth, to experience it as our truth. And then we allow ourselves to be blessed and to be blessings as a result of this experiencing, of this expression. We recognize that as this is true for us, it is true for all. This is happening on this planet, this entire planet, right here and right now. We are not special. We are not isolated. We are one of a global awakening. And we are consciously saying yes to this awakening. And for this awakening, and for each of us who is consciously saying yes and playing in this, and for the awakening itself, I'm ever so grateful. I know it is good, and each of us is good. And so I move this word spoken, into a law that moves it into form, moves it into expression, and allows it to blossom in our lives in the most beautiful, perfect, and wonderful ways. Knowing it already does so, it is already happening because we have said yes. And so we affirm this and know this is the truth by joining together and simply saying, and so it is. Thank you.
Serve and remember. Serve